Hello, my name is Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm talking about, can happiness exist without suffering? And before I get into that, just want to say I'm glad to be back and doing a video. The last few months have been hectic and strange. October here in St. Petersburg, we got two back-to-back hurricanes. November, much of that was devoted to repair and recovery. The ceiling of this Florida room had collapsed, and so this room was unusable for many weeks. And so, and then after that, I caught COVID and lost my voice and felt like crap through December. And so the last 3 months have been a trip. But I'm back. I'm hoping to do videos a little more consistently, at least maybe a couple times a month at least. Not sure if I'll do it weekly, but with some regularity, I'd like to have videos. But back to the question at hand. Can happiness exist without suffering? Now, the short answer is yes, but I'm going to explain this quite a bit more. The classic pairing is pain and pleasure, because pain is inevitable. And it also gives rise to the possibility of pleasure, because to feel a soft caress across your arm, for example, requires sensitivity and feeling touch. And so that pleasure comes from touch. And because there's touch, if you get a cut, it's going to hurt. So there's pain. Pain and pleasure are connected in that way. In that where there's pleasure, there can also be pain. And because there's accidents and things happen, inevitably, pain will happen. Pain is inevitable. It will arise during certain points of your life. If you like the pleasure of candy and you get a cavity and you need to get it drilled out at the dentist and it's going to hurt a bit, those two things go together. If you like the pleasure of eating and overeat and you've got an upset stomach or whatever, though that pain and pleasure kind of goes together. Pleasure, when taken too far, quickly turns into pain. And so the two are kind of connected. Now, I totally agree with pain and pleasure being connected. But at some point, a lot of people, I think, extrapolated too far. Instead of pain and pleasure, they started saying happiness and suffering, as if these two are, absolutely linked and must arise together. And that is incorrect. It is very possible for suffering to cease to arise and still feel happiness. Awakening happened in 2005 for me. It's been 19 years. And there really hasn't been suffering. But there's been happiness, there's been joy, there's been awe. All this still exists. If anything, more so than it used to. And so to say, well, in order to feel happiness, you've got to suffer, is incorrect. You don't have to suffer. And if some people go, well, you won't know what happiness is unless you suffer. Well, guess what? Everybody suffered already. Since childhood. As we got conditioned into the body, mind, and the complex and ego identity and all the issues it has, since childhood, we have all experienced suffering. And so that is our reference point. We don't need to have a constant reminder of what suffering is in order to recognize happiness. We have suffered. We remember suffering. And so we don't need it any further in order to feel happiness. Now, if you've never suffered, then yeah, I could see potentially what is happiness then. Because happiness is kind of an up tick or an up kind of feeling as opposed to neutrality. And if you've never suffered, do you really feel happiness? Well, that's questionable. But that's a philosophical argument because there's no one who hasn't suffered. Everyone who has suffered, everyone has experience with suffering, everyone knows what suffering is. Or at least knows it by experience. Too often people can confuse pain and suffering. And that's where I think the incorrect extrapolation comes, is because pain and pleasure, yes, are kind of two things that go together. But pain is not the same as suffering. Those are two different things. As a prior video mentioned, because suffering is in the mind. Suffering is mentally made up hurt and misery. Pain comes from the nerves. It's a response due to injury and damage. And so while one is actually grounded in reality, the other one's fictitious. It's in the head. Suffering is just made up. And so pain and suffering are two different things. And so don't extrapolate pain and pleasure and turn the pain part into suffering and the pleasure into happiness. Because pleasure is not happiness either. See, this is the other thing, is so many people confuse chasing pleasures as happiness. Oh, the pleasure seeking. When I'm in pleasure and all the pleasure seeking, I'm happy. Well, that's a misnomer and incorrect statement as well. Because pleasure and happiness are two different things. Pleasures are temporary. They will end. It is possible for happiness to not end, for happiness to more or less be the normal state. And there might be higher levels of greater happiness into joy and bliss, but they're all similar flavors to happiness. So they're not totally unrelated. And staying in that flavor, in that vein of happiness, joy, bliss, is something that does not have to go away. It goes away because we push it away. We make ourselves miserable. We make ourselves suffer because of our own beliefs, our own viewpoints, our own, the conditioning and the stuff in our heads. And without that, happiness can remain, regardless if the pleasures come and go. Because the people who are pleasure seeking, the people who are attached to the pleasures as happiness, that they think that is happiness, are unhappy many of the time. Because what happens is pleasures are temporary. And like I said with eating or whatever, pleasures, when taken too far, turn into pain. You eat, if you really enjoy food and you keep eating and you make yourself sick, then you're hurting. And so what'll happen is either it will turn into pain or it'll go away and cause suffering if you're attached to it. So if you're attached to the continuation of pleasure because you're equating pleasure with happiness, then you're going to suffer far more recurringly. And so it's important to not equate suffering with pain. You don't want to equate suffering with pain or pleasure with happiness, because those are not the same. And so in this kind of roundabout way, the end result is, yes, suffering can end, suffering can end, pleasure can come and go, but regardless of the coming and going of pleasure, or even coming and going of pain, there can be happiness. Because even when I had COVID, didn't feel that good, I was still happy. In terms of, in that flavor. I mean, I wasn't giddy happy. Oh, this is awesome being sick. That wasn't the kind of thing. But there is this contentment, there is this peace, there is this happiness of just being. It's like, well, yeah, there is this pain and this cough and, feeling like crud and not being able to talk, but, just being brings happiness, because our very being is happiness. Our very being is the spring from which happiness arises. I mean, look at children. Before they learn to make themselves miserable, before they learn to to push happiness away. Children seem to be in constant happiness, joy, awe. Yeah, I mean, if they're hurt, there's a temporary cry. But a lot of times, a momentary distraction and they forget about the injury and they're happy again. If you ever noticed with a child who, had a toy taken away or fell down and they're crying, then you give them a treat or a toy and they're happy again. It distracted them from the misery they were creating for themselves. And then they return to their more natural state of happiness, which is arising from their own being without restraint. As adults, we've learned to restrain our happiness and joy to a large degree, unfortunately. And so there is this possibility, I would say, of happiness sustained without having to be reminded about what happiness is via suffering, because even happiness is not a level, flat thing, because the emotions vary. And so happiness, could go, there's peace and contentment and happiness and joy and bliss, and then it might lower back down, and then the bliss might go away and the joy might go away, and you'll return to more of a mild happiness. And there's this fluctuation that can happen in happiness. So it's not like happiness is a static state, because anything static, it quickly fades into the background and is forgotten. There is no static bliss or static happiness that's unchanging forever. Anything unchanging is soon not noticed anymore, no longer perceived, because our brains filter out all that is unchanging. Because we do not feel the 10 to 15 pounds of air pressure compressing on our bodies at all times, because we've always had it on us. We don't notice it. There's a lot of things like that are constantly happening that we just don't notice because they are constants. The mind doesn't keep track of constants. If it's constant, it's forgotten. It's unseen. It fades into the background. And so happiness, when I'm talking about happiness does not go away, I am not saying it's a constant. It varies. And then that varying to, not only do you have the memory of suffering in your past, which everybody's suffered, but then the emotions vary to boot. And so that there are various levels or flavors of happiness that vary throughout the day. And so it's very easy to recognize this is happiness, this is joy, this could be bliss, this is awe. You can recognize the various flavors without having pain or suffering needed to provide context. Now, the pain will arise. The pain is inevitable. The suffering is not inevitable. The suffering is optional, and the suffering can end. And when suffering ends, it does not mean happiness goes away, because you can live without suffering and still be happy for years and years and years, like my past 19 years. And so that's the message for today. If you got any questions, comments, please post below. Until next time, thank you much.